Well, thank you all for joining us here today. We know that we all have the same old 1,440 minutes a day, and your time is valuable. So I always strive to make sure that we make it worthwhile for you. And today I have zero doubt that you are going to love this episode. We were really lucky to be able to get Derrick Chevalier speaking with us today. And we're going to be talking about negotiation tips from the creator of a cutting-edge new approach to negotiations. He comes with lots of chops. So welcome, Derrick. It's so great to have you here.
Well, thank you. You have lots of chops as well. So I'm excited to have a conversation and learn and share and hopefully come up with some good stuff for your audience. But thank you so much for the invitation. It's a privilege.
Yeah, so thrilled to be here. And I think we both share the view that all of life is a negotiation. So think outside that box. And for those of you who don't know him, as the executive vice president of Harrison-Chevalier, Inc., Derrick leads a team of negotiation consultants and trainers who help clients exceed their goals in various domains. He's everything from procurement to sales to real estate, finance, law, politics, international relations, project management, engineering, you name it. He's got experience in it. And I'm really excited to be having a hardcore discussion about actual negotiations today. Sometimes we go a little off field, stretching the envelope, but today we're right on track. So tell us first, how'd you come to do this line of work, Derrick?
Well, I actually prepared most of my academic life to go into law from the time I was about 14. Wow. I really loved that. Yeah. But just as I was getting to law school, on the way, I did some teaching at university, and then I went into the private sector in sales and real estate. And just as I was going to law school, I saw an advertisement for negotiation facilitators. Yeah. And I thought, that sounds interesting. And it turned out to be the Karrass International Organization, and Dr. Chester Karrass is one of the original gurus. He had the first negotiation on-site, off-site law, and has been going for 50 years. They're actually the largest negotiation training organization. Yeah. So I competed for a spot with them and won it. And then I spent about 14 years on the road doing facilitating and organizing his framework for companies all over the world, really, and working with him, with his son, and with the co-creator of the program, Frank Mobus. Yeah. So, and then by the time I got to law school, I had been working so much in the negotiation area. When I got to law school, I realized that negotiation really was my calling. And so that's what I've done. After 14 years, I left Karrass and then went off to discover how to build. I wanted to build a universally adaptable negotiation framework. Yeah. And that's what I started working on.
I love that. And it's funny when you say Karrass. I mean, my gosh, I can't remember a flight I had early in my career where you didn't see those big full page ads he had in the magazines, right? I'm like, who is this guy?
Well, that's what grew that business, you know. He had a marketing person who came and said, hey, why don't we put a 4-page color insert into magazine? Because at that time, almost all of the people on flights were business people. Yeah, it was smart. And that grew his business. And people would call up and say, hey, I want to book a seminar. I go, well, why did you hear about us? And they go, look, I've been seeing this ad for 10 years. It must be something good. Must be something good in here.
That's so super, super smart marketing strategy. So before we talk about where I know you've suggested some sort of evolution, if you will, from some of the older models, I'd love if you could talk about what were some of the elements of effective negotiation that you would endorse from the methods and protocols you got from Karrass.
So I say this, I still love and promote the Karrass program, of course, because it was such a diamond in my life. Yeah. But I do look at a couple of things. The key part for Karrass negotiation is that it's built solidly in the transactional world. So if you buy or if you sell or if you're involved in transactional real estate or real business, that's where the nugget is there, because Dr. Karrass, who was an engineer, was actually working for the Hughes Corporation and in the procurement area. So it stands to reason that procurement was really his bailiwick. So a couple of things that come out of that people will recognize, for instance, is a rule like don't split the difference.
Yeah.
Right? So, and which more recently was adopted by Chris Voss, who said never split the difference, right? So in the universal world that I looked at, we went back, and after 14 years of using that rule and promoting that rule, I started to notice idiosyncrasies about that particular rule and others. And one of those idiosyncrasies is that if you really study the curriculum of either Chris Voss, obviously never split the difference is a takeoff from don't split the difference. So both of them suffer, in my view, from the same issue. And that is they actually contradict other rules in their own programs. Which, right? And clearly they didn't realize that over time. Well, what would that rule be? When you're teaching somebody a rule that says either don't do anything, or don't split the difference, or never split the difference, you're teaching someone to build in a tell and a vulnerability, or what I call fatal flaw, into their negotiating strategy, because you're teaching someone to eliminate a possibility that in some negotiation frameworks may be the best option available to you. So if I later say don't split the difference, but then I later come back and I say don't create patterns in your negotiation, well, I just taught you a rule that in itself is a pattern.
Yeah. That's great.
Right.
I love that. Yeah. And it's funny when you say about Chris, because one of the things I thought as I was reading his book, and I was in the process of writing my book, and everybody kept saying to me, nobody's going to want a book on negotiation. And then his comes out and explodes. And I was like, damn, I wish I'd got ahead. But I found a few inconsistencies, to be quite honest, right? Like he talks a lot about building rapport and things. And yet the whole beginning of the book is him bragging about how great his negotiation was with the Harvard people because he refused to answer any questions and gave them no information. I'm like, that's not necessarily a great negotiation strategy. That strikes me as kind of counterintuitive, but anyhow.
Well, I'll be honest about that. So first of all, you and I would recognize that never split the difference. Dr. Karrass's book was literally written 50 years before. So it wasn't an original idea, right? But the other issue that I have with Chris Voss's approach is this. He has a 25-year background as an FBI negotiator. So when a hostage negotiator. So when I'm talking to professionals, I'll ask them, so how many negotiations professionally are you involved in where the person you're negotiating with is either dead or in jail at the end of the negotiation? Well, most corporate executives go, gee, none. And I'm going, so how does a guy where everybody was dead and in jail, how was that training to teach and prepare you how to negotiate? So that's a good question.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm laughing because you and I are on the same page. I'm reading the book going, okay, everybody's raving about these amazing negotiation prowess. Almost none of the examples he gave worked or would really in any definition be considered successful negotiations, right? I mean, one, they gave up.
Well, the guy goes in jail, the person's in jail or dead. Well, for him, that's now let's look at it again. So where might that approach be effective, and what can we glean from that book that's important? Well, if you look at it, you look at the circumstances around all of a hostage negotiation. So I would say that if you take Chris Voss's book and you then say, I have a negotiation where the outcome is do or die for me.
Absolutely.
I have a negotiation where the time frame is finite. Like this has got to happen today and not tomorrow. And the consequences of it not happening are so great that I can't afford not to get it done. So if we look at a negotiation in which our parameters are the same as those parameters, then you might be able to apply some of those principles within a specific negotiating sector but it would have to be in those parameters, because otherwise you're missing a lot of opportunity.
Yeah. Well, and one of the
Yeah.
things that really impressed me about you, to be honest, Derrick, was that you, like, even with all of those years under your belt with sort of the Dr. Karrass method, you went on to, very intentionally to gain insights and experience in other frameworks, other disciplines. And you ended up developing the Comprehensive Negotiating Strategies Universal Framework, which is a mouthful.
A mouthful. We actually call it CNSUF, or snuff.
Yeah.
For sure.
I like that. That's easier. So tell us about that. Like, brag a little bit about it. What makes it unique, and why is it a better model, do you think, than some of the other frameworks that we see out there?
Thank you so much for that question. Well, for one, what I wanted to do was to look at principles of negotiation going all the way back to Sun Tzu.
Yeah.
And to look Alexander the Great, all the great negotiators, and to say what principles existed then, have stood the test of time, and work today. And then where are those principles? Where can they or do they need to be updated or refined, given that we have the technology and the opportunities that we have?
Yeah.
And so that was one of the driving forces there.
Yeah.
One of the things that I then did is I went back and I looked at widely held beliefs. For instance, the belief of a win-win negotiation. And after that 14 years and all the thousands of negotiations I facilitated and working with people, I started to realize something. Or you take something like a BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement, that would be one. So both of those are similar in this way, that you and I start to get ready for a negotiation. You set a target that you want to hit. I set a target that I want to hit, the highest I want or the lowest I'll go, right? Pretty much like a BATNA. Now, when we come to that negotiation, a win-win negotiation generally is when both parties feel that they've given up something, but they've reached that an outcome somewhere between that high and that low that they had predetermined they wanted to hit. So if you look at it from a quantitative standpoint, if I walk away and determine that it was a win-win outcome based upon an outcome that was somewhere between my high and low, who was I actually negotiating against during that time?
Yeah.
That's a question for you. Who am I negotiating against?
Yeah, you're kind of negotiating against yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. You're negotiating against yourself. So in fact, the only reason that you feel it was a win-win outcome is because you got an outcome that you set parameters based on principles that you knew. Well, that's not necessary. It feels good.
Yeah.
And maybe we call it, but for me, all that is, we simply say that that's an outcome that was in the parameters that we set. So I just suggest to people, look, let's be honest about it. It's win-win because you decided it was win-win. On the other hand, it's win-win. Perhaps the other person absolutely would have done double what you said, or perhaps you got twice as much from them as they would have given to anybody else, in which case the outcome wasn't win-win at all, but actually a competitive negotiation in which one party did better, but the other party doesn't know it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because I find really seasoned mediators, like in all my years of adjudicating as well, who would come away and say, I know I've done a great job, when everyone walks away unhappy. And I'm like, that strikes me as a ridiculously flawed premise for a mediator. And given what you're saying, it's almost like you're splitting the baby with yourself, right? It's like, okay, I've got this. So it really is another way.
It feels good. But so what do we look at? In the CNF-UF program, what we look at is how much of the outcome is based upon information or insight or data that we did not have or did not consider prior to the negotiation starting. So the outcome is not going to likely be anything that we expected, because if we're focused on how much can I learn about what's on your sheet that I don't know, that is going to open up opportunities that I never would have thought were possible,
Yeah.
because I was only looking at my own outcome of the top and the bottom.
Yeah.
Now, if I go and I measure and I say, well, the outcome now is based on facts we didn't have,
Yeah.
it's more likely to be a cooperative negotiation in which both parties got acceptable outcomes, but also not outcomes that they expected to get.
And I want to peel that back a bit for the listener. I think this is such an important point that you're hitting on, Derrick, and it is so often missed. We are so conditioned in what we think is that competitive model to come from this very ego-driven place, all about what do I want? What do I need? What are my considerations? We don't show up with curiosity. We don't do any of the prep work necessary to find out about the other party and what they want. We don't bring creativity to the table. So often it's like, I want X, you want Y, or we think we do, and there's actually a solution that's better for all of us, for both of us, but if we don't get curious, we don't see it. So I love that. Share some techniques for influencing decisions and outcomes with us, like some concrete stuff for our listeners. What are some techniques that they can take away today that'll help them influence those decisions and maybe get some better outcomes?
Okay. So one of the things that I really think is important to negotiate is to negotiate the person that is on the other side rather than the issue.
Yeah.
Because ultimately another elements of the CNS model are that people are driven by the institutions, organizations, by the political system and the economic level, socioeconomic level they grew up in. That's what's driving their wants and needs. So there are some idiosyncrasies within their background that you and I don't know anything about. And those drivers are going to restrain what the outcome could be. They're also going to inform how I ought to approach you, what types of questions I should ask, and where I should be, where my curiosity, because I love that, should be placed. And that really should be placed on what are the characteristics of the person that I'm negotiating with. And then as I discover more about that, I select specific tools and tactics that are likely to be more successful than other tools and tactics that I just showed up with, because that's my background. So that would be one important element. You negotiate people, not problems. That would be one.
I really feel that's one of the fundamental problems with our legal system, right? I mean, you have a system that's based on this model where lawyers are taught to the extent just bulldoze ahead with your agenda. And I think the entire system, you know, we call it the other side and opposing counsel, and everything is about that sort of win-lose approach. And so many lawyers, even when you so-called win a lawsuit, most people walk away feeling like they've just done 15 rounds with, you know, Muhammad Ali, for heaven's sake. It's like, there's no gracious win there because nobody bothers to give a shit about what the other side really wants. What are the real drivers, not what they've got in their application. What are the real drivers that are driving this particular conflict between these parties?
Right. Right. That's so, because often if we really understand the driving motivations of issues that come up and separate people, a lot of times it's about a human need that a person has. There are often times when an apology has eliminated a multi-six-figure demand, because what really somebody was wanted was an acknowledgement that you were wrong. Right. And when that comes, that's really what they were looking for. But if I only focused on the dollars and cents, then I'm not really understanding. Even if they got it, it doesn't satisfy the need that they actually had, the human needs. And of course, so when we talk about negotiating the person, we're talking about negotiating those human needs. And we look at the need for certainty. Some people need that. And each human need begets the next one. A need for certainty begets a need for uncertainty.
Yeah.
But when we're uncertainty, it eliminates significance. So we have a need for significance, and then we also have a need for connection.
Yeah.
So the question is, what tactics and strategies are going to help us identify what those needs are, and then what tactics or strategies are going to help us fulfill them?
Yeah.
But I want to follow up on one other point you made that's connected to the law school approach versus where I was having worked in negotiation. One of the key elements there is that lawyers are taught to pursue and base their objective on the precedents of the case that they're looking at.
Yeah.
A negotiator, especially a CNSUF negotiator, is looking to create a precedent.
Yeah.
Well, that's the exact opposite of what legal training does for people. Because if I'm looking at the precedents, the outcome is how many of the circumstances in the precedents of the cases that are involved here are connected to your case that I can prove.
Yeah.
But if we're looking to find an outcome that neither of us expected, the question is, how do we forge and create a precedent that wasn't there before?
Oh, that
It's
is so good.
very fundamentally different.
Well, and it takes away, because the traditional approach takes away any opportunity for creative outcomes, right? Which is where
Right.
you're going to get those best. Okay. If we're only looking to the past to be able to
Right.
follow those precedents and parrot one of those, we're missing any opportunity to move forward with better, more creative, futuristic kind of options. So
Absolutely. And so like you know, one of the things I started taking my daughter on the road, my son, when he was about 3, I learned a few things about that, but my daughter, when she was about 7. And in that case, they had an opportunity to interact with lots of people. They sat in dozens of negotiation seminars and learned a lot. But as my daughter is approaching law school, has just finished law school now,
yeah.
she's coming to law school with both of those approaches. She understands that the approach and the precedents and the need to be and understand how to pursue that. But she also understands that there's an opportunity to look outside of that, because I always say to her, look, people say, think out of the side of the box. And my response is, well, you have to have a box to think outside of.
Yeah. What a gift you gave to your kids, though. Oh my gosh, Derrick. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking that was probably one of the big advantages that I had. Like, I grew up in a low rental apartment in what was considered sort of a tough neighborhood. And I had that street smart approach that I got from my dad, always debating and discussing and thinking, not that traditional old school kind of model, but how do we find something different here, right? How do we not?
Different.
Yeah. So
yeah, and that's exciting. So I want to share one other thing.
Yeah.
So in the CNF-UF program, here's the difference. We have gone from a win-lose or a one-win or a one-lose process, which is top to bottom, to a continuum.
Yeah.
So on that continuum, on the far left of that continuum, is the fundamental purpose of competition.
Yeah.
Now, in the fundamental purpose of competition from a historical standpoint, that would be war.
Yeah.
Because ultimately there's life and death that's driving the outcome. So that's as competitive as you can be. And there's a clear winner. Whoever has more people living at the end wins.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, we have something we call all win. In between those 2 points is a range of cooperative possibilities.
Yeah.
So as the win-win that is we talked about, where I start with a low and a high, and you start with a low and a high, and we come somewhere in that would be placed somewhere not in the middle, but just shy of the middle of that continuum, because we never had an opportunity to discover all the things that were actually left on the table. And the second part of that, on the all win end of it, all win is like being married, right? So you're not a little bit married. You are either all in or you're not in.
Yeah.
So If it's engagement, well, that's almost all win
Yeah.
because you don't have the same obligation and engagement as you do in marriage. So you can have a very, very cooperative, symbiotic relationship, but we define those differences between the fact that when something's all win, all the consequences, all the information, all the risks, and all of the advantages are equally shared by everyone, so that anything that happens to me happens to you, which is my guarantee. And then if ever that changes,
Yeah.
then it falls out of that all win back into some level of cooperation or of competition, depending. So it's a completely different, that continuum is where the creativity can happen. And the
Yeah.
other thing is to be aware of the fact that when I say win-win, we simply say, well, yeah, it's a cooperative outcome with these elements,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so there are more cooperative outcomes in which you share a lot of what you did not think you were willing to share at the beginning. I share a lot,
Yeah.
but where we are from a competitive standpoint has to do with how closely the value and consequences of what I share with you versus what you share with me. The
Yeah.
more equivalent those are, the more cooperative our outcome, and the less they are, the more competitive that we are. And that would then impact the rules, tactics, and strategy that we would build.
I like that. Wait, and what a simple model, right? I mean, that like visually you can see it, this idea about the spectrum. I haven't heard anybody frame it like that before, and it makes perfect sense. So
Yeah.
let's talk a bit about rapport and trust. I mean, why is it important and how do you build it?
So great. One of the first things in terms of, and of course, I have a book called Influence Rapport Results that talks about this. And a lot of times when I start with definitions. And one of the things that doing so many seminars taught me is that people assume that they have the same definitions of words that are common words.
Yeah.
And when you ask them, what you find out is they don't have the same definition at all. And so you're never going to get to a place of agreement if we are attaching different definitions to words, right? So we start there. So when we talk about influence, it starts with the other side of that is persuasion.
Yeah.
So we either have persuasive approach or an approach of influence. And here's the two differences. By definition, persuasion is to compel someone into a position. Now, we can do that with an argument or physically. We can do that with a law or a chain or a threat.
Yeah.
But whenever we're persuading someone, we are literally using some apparatus to push them into a position that we want them to be in. We are persuading or compelling them to believe or accept something that we are selling or buying or wanting, right? Now, by contrast, if you go into a room and you say, well, what's the definition of persuasion? If there are 10 people in the room, you're going to get 15 answers to that question, right?
That's true.
Now, by contrast, where I found the biggest disconnect was in the idea of influence. The dictionary, depending on which one you look at, actually shows definitions that persuasion and influence are in some dictionaries synonyms.
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous when you look at the etymology of the words, because influence comes from the 14th century, and influence was thought to be a fluid coming down from the heavens and coming inside someone. And that's where you get Cupid from. The idea that suddenly you look at someone and you're in love. Well, you just looked at 10 people. Why that person?
Yeah.
Well, because there was an ethereal fluid that comes down and impacts your feelings, your whole physiology, and you now have a feeling about someone that you never met. That's influence. So if you look at the definition of influence, influence is to have an effect, impact on the behavior, thoughts, or actions of another human being without their being aware of it.
Yeah.
So you cannot persuade someone without their knowing about it, because if you're compelling them,
Yeah.
they're aware that they're being compelled.
Yeah.
Influence, on the other hand, is using both body language, words, location. It's using a set of physiologically based elements that cause someone to feel something
Yeah.
without their actually understanding why they feel that way. That's when we have influence. So creating influence goes all the way back to what we said. We're negotiating the human being. And in corporate and legal negotiations, we actually most of the time are not even negotiating with the person that's in front of us.
Yeah.
We're often negotiating with people we don't even know, who are influencing the person or persuading the person that we're negotiating with. So those are a couple points that I think are important.
Yeah. Great distinction. And I actually didn't know the etymology of the influence, but I would have agreed with the end result, but it's interesting to hear the background about how we came to it. And it goes to when you talk about that body language and everything too. One of the things, again, I know Voss sort of really popularized this idea about talking about mirroring and matching and that. And that, I think it takes a lot of skill to be able to do that effectively. And I think sadly, people,
Right.
that book, most people get all up in their head and they're sitting there and then they become so, it's the opposite of building rapport. As opposed
Right.
to tone of voice, though, that's different. I mean, I can get very excitable and I speak really passionately. And if I'm dealing with somebody who's an introvert and somebody who I know takes longer to process their ideas, with 2 out of 3 of my kids, I have to slow myself down and show up differently and decide in advance, who am I going to be? Who do I want to show up as to have more influence, right? To be able to influence them.
And a key part of that you just described is effective communication, which has to do with tone, voice,
Yep.
speed, all of
Absolutely.
that. But again, another piece from CNFUF, we define effective communication, again, very differently than everyone else. We define effective communication as congruence of meaning.
I like that.
So that is not the exchange of words, which happens, but congruence of meaning happens at the point where you agree that I understand your point of view.
Yeah.
And so we use the reframing and all that is only for that purpose, so that I might say, well, as I understand what you're saying, Cindy, is XYZ. And then ultimately what you're likely to say is, well, no, that's not exactly what I mean. Exactly. So then you would embellish and clarify not the words that you said, but the meaning that you were intending to convey. And so once you agree that I understand your meaning, we have achieved a congruence of meaning. Now, from a tactical standpoint, that's pretty incredible, because when people have a congruence of meaning, one of the tactical things that happens is, if you suddenly said, Derrick, thank you for taking the time. Yes, that's what I mean. And I say, well, thank you for sharing. I'm glad that we both understand, and I understand what you're hearing. From a tactical standpoint, something happens to that other person. And what that is that they're very often likely to believe that because we've reached a congruence of meaning, that we agree.
Yeah.
When in fact, I may not agree with you at all. I've simply exposed and solidified that I understand your point of view. So from tactically, depending on what my objectives are, that's going to be a piece of information that informs how I continue to react and interact with you.
Yeah. So important. I love that. And again, I often talk a lot of people pay lip service to the concept of active listening. And I call it enhanced active listening, where when you're reflecting back to somebody what they say, you actually put their position even more eloquently than they did. And I think that goes back to that congruence you said. And the other thing, in addition to what you said, Derrick, I find, I don't know your experience on this, but it triggers, not only do they think we've agreed, so now you've changed that dynamic between us, but it triggers reciprocity as well, right? Because suddenly they're like, oh my God, she just made my argument better than I did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and then what happens when that occurs, that's where the space for creativity occurs, because I may not have intended to end in a cooperative
Yeah.
outcome with you at all. But upon having that agreement, and that reciprocity happens, and I say, well, you're now listening to me, and suddenly you think, well, I didn't know that about Derrick. And
Yeah.
so now we come back and say, well, look, what I was really looking for here, and I might then expose insight that I never intended to give you, opening up a possibility for a creative outcome that never would have happened had we been focused on the top and bottom that we walked into the room looking for.
Yeah.
So
good.
It's much more about psychology and physiology and human behavior than it is about the rules and tactics and all of that. We're dealing with human beings, both ourselves and with the other person. And when we can get there, it opens up the opportunity for creative solution.
So nice. We are definitely in alignment on that. So now, and typically in any negotiation, there's gonna be objections. And so what are some strategies that you suggest for, under your system to handle that pushback and resistance?
So a lot of it has to do with communication styles. So you just said, and you and I are clearly similar, that I'm animated and I'm out there, and I can be a little scary just in terms of my physical presence and the way, I'm pretty confident. If you look at me, I'm walking, whoa. So what I have to do is I have to change that physical demeanor. I also have to change my voice and become more open. So first thing that I do is to understand and look at my counterpart's communication style.
Yeah.
And I think about that juxtaposed to my own. So if I see, as you suggested, someone who is a thinker, who needs to process something, then I need to back off and give them an opportunity, which may change my time frame. But if I came in with a time frame that was definitive, then I'm going to push. And if I'm dealing with a thinker, all I'm going to do is push them away. So strategies that involve understanding and creating an environment for more influence and collaboration really include allowing the other person to be who they are, and then responding in a way that is unexpected to them. And I'll give you one nugget here. What is the antidote to any tactic or technique, strategy, or idea? What would you say?
The antidote to like if somebody's using a tactic on me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and again, it'll depend on all the things that we've talked about, but I often find it effective to call it out, but not in a way where you're calling the person out by making them defensive about it, but making it almost as if a joke, like, come on, are we really at the stage where we're going to be using these tactics on each other? How about, and then try and divert it to a more productive.
And that's very effective. In your demeanor, I see that you have a range that will change. But in CNSUF, what we're looking for are universal principles that in many instances don't have an exception. So this is it. The counter to any tactic or technique is the tactic or technique or its opposite.
Yeah.
And that is universal. Now, where does that come from?
And just to clarify for our listeners there, to make sure they understand. So when you're saying, like, if somebody's using a tactic, that in every case, you're either going to do the opposite or you're going to play that tactic back. Is that what you mean by that?
Exactly. Because the antidote, if you're screaming and I'm screaming, neither of us is hearing anything.
Yeah.
If you're quiet and I'm quiet, then we're mirroring one another. So if you think about the antidote to any tactic or technique is that tactic or technique in order to neutralize it, and not necessarily eliminate it. It is to neutralize the effectiveness of that tactic in that person. And I'll give you a little bit of background of where that came from. When I was in college, I hung out with some guys that were herpetologists. And we go out collecting poisonous rattlesnakes.
Wow.
Well, many years later in negotiation, I'd ask myself the question, well, what is an antidote to any tactic or technique? You don't see it in any other writing.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me, when someone's bit by a rattlesnake, they go to the hospital, the doctor will first ask, what kind of snake bit you?
Yeah.
Where were you? What the shape of the bite was, so that they can identify the characteristics of the venom that you were injected with. And then what do they give you? An antivenom.
Yeah.
Now, where does the antivenom come from? The venom of the very snake that bought you.
That's a great metaphor.
Right? And it doesn't take the venom out of your body. It actually neutralizes the negative impacts of the venom in your body. So ultimately, I said, well, if it works in nature, it works in negotiation, and it does. So a place to neutralize is to first say, I can come high or low. That is, I can reframe and repeat and reflect what you're doing, or I can do the opposite of that. So if someone's yelling, and then you were to sit back in your chair and simply be demure, while the person's yelling, at some point they're yelled out, you're not reacting, and you take all of the air out of what they thought the fear and anger and yelling was going to accomplish, and you haven't moved. So, but you've neutralized that tactic. So that's an easy one to remember, and it has a very substantial underlying rationale.
And great application too, because I can see that being really effective if you're dealing with bullies, for example, right? As well, using that tactics. And the other thing that's interesting, we tend to all woo, right, when we're faced with the, emotion on the other side in whatever way. But for me, that's where the gold is sometimes, because that person is showing, a spot. When you said, what are their triggers from their childhood, from what they're bringing to the table? When you're able to let yourself sit back and assess that, it can be a really powerful tool. So
because well, when you look at communication styles, we look at the omnipotent commander, somebody who shouts orders, raises their voice, gives commands. Well, why did they have that? Say they're an attorney or an advanced executive or something, and they're very successful. Why does somebody like that have that type of communication style? Well, clearly because it's worked for them. Right. So now, if they are getting all of these accolades and raising in their career, and they've used that communication style, they believe it works. So one of the things that we're able to do is we can respond to that, and then that will often escalate things, right? And then when mano a mano, the best person will win. But on the other hand, when we retreat and take the opposite approach, it literally causes them to feel embarrassed. They feel embarrassed because it didn't work, right? And they're like, dealing with a bully is, in my view, one of the easiest things to understand, because once a bully, and if you know they're a bully, the first thing you really want to do is get them to lose their temper. Because if you interacted with a bully, and there could have been times in my life when that might have been me, so, being honest.
Guilty as charged.
I know about that. Once the bully is triggered and they fire off, what generally happens? They feel like a 2-year-old that you can lead around by their ear, because if it's successful, they're emboldened. But when it's not, they feel as though the covers have been pulled, and that didn't work. And now they're ashamed and embarrassed, like an alcoholic who's saying, oh, I got drunk again, and I'm so sorry, and I didn't mean it, and blah, 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 and I'll do whatever you want me to do. So in some cases, understanding that allowing that communication type to have their way is the smartest thing you can do, because now they're willing to do something to make up for it.
It's so true.
Especially if it's a man versus a woman. You can really disarm a man and make him feel like, and then suddenly you're sitting there and you're looking, they're looking at you, and now suddenly that person is 4 years old, and they're going, sorry,
Yeah, so
sorry,
true. And
you
even
know?
layering on that, as you say, one of the things that I've found really effective, especially in that sort of gendered situation where you've got somebody who's just going off and getting in your face, and let them spew and sprittle and all the things.
Yes.
And then just say, look, even when they, especially when they're not showing the behavior, to say, look, I know it's important for you to really treat people with dignity and respect. And I'm not sure what's happening here, but let's talk about it. And then it's like, you just see the entire, on the others, and it's like,
Boom.
and everything
Boom,
realigns in a
boom.
minute. So
Because what you did was you spoke an important phrase into them rather than being critical,
yeah,
rather than responding in kind. You said, after all that, I know that ultimately you want to be kind and we both want to find a way through. And it's like, okay, I didn't get beat up, and I didn't get a criticism, and what I got was somebody saying and appealing to the best of me.
yeah,
And now that I've got that out of my system, you're more likely to get it, right?
yeah.
I'll tell you an anecdote that for some people, if they're young, they won't get this, but I am older, and my mom did not have this idea that, well, you don't spank kids. My mom had a different idea about that. So whenever I would kind of get one of these sessions, she would say, well, I know a man walked into this room. She goes, but the boy is going to show up before we walk out. and,
That's
and
good.
ultimately, it was when I would come in and feel shut down and bold and full of venom. And at some point, there'd be that moment in which I would start to cry. And once I let that go, my mom would sit down and say, let's talk.
Yeah.
And I could hear it. And I could hear it. Now, today, people are not so much into that, but it worked for me insofar as my understanding that sometimes people have to go through that door in order to get on the other side of it. So if I had run away, or if she didn't allow me to go through that transition, I may never have gotten to the point of, so many years later, sitting in the film, what was it, Traveling Pants, right? Do you remember that movie? So here we were sitting in the movie, and I think Catherine was 6 or 8 years old. We're watching the movie. And we're watching the movie. Tears just started streaming by my face, and I'm watching the movie, and I start to have these tears in my face. And I'm kind of thinking, well, I'm not going to look over. And suddenly, my daughter squeezed my hand, and she said, "It's okay, Dad. I read the book."
I love
So
it.
many years after that, I happened to give her the thrill of her life, and we went over and had dinner with Ken, who directed the movie, because he
Wow.
was a hero of hers. So she didn't know. Yeah, that elevated me a little bit
I
too. And
bet.
Ken loved it. Her first words to him was, "I love you, you damn." Yeah. Well, I was the one crying in the movie. But
Yeah.
I think that ability to get into my emotions and be okay with that
Yeah.
came from being raised by a woman. And my mom used to say, people think men don't cry. And she said, it's exactly the opposite. Only a man has the courage to.
Yeah. Oh, I love your mom.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, so good.
Yeah.
Well, I can't believe, Derek, I could talk to you for hours and hours about this, and I can't believe how quick our time has gone. Would love to have you come back and do sort of a sequel to this. Maybe we can focus on, because what you were just touching on then, I could see us doing a whole segment on gender in negotiations and the impact.
Sure, I would love to do that. And you
Love
know
that.
what? I've got the new 2025 edition of Evolve or Be Slaughtered. The book that talks about the framework is going to be coming out in the next couple months.
Yeah.
So I would love to come back and maybe we'll talk about some of that new material that's in there with related to gender, because I think that's a piece that's part of what you're doing in your work. And
Yeah.
it's certainly one that I want to talk about. And sometimes coming from someone like me, not somebody you would necessarily is the right person to be speaking to women about it, but I think my experience might be helpful in how to deal with someone that
Yep.
presents the way I do in
Yeah.
terms of that power, because it's an important thing for me in terms of my dedication and my homage to my own mom and upbringing. So I'd
I love
love
it.
to do that.
Well, I would love that. And before we sign out today, I normally love to ask, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? And it doesn't have to be about negotiation at all, Derek, just one of those things when you go have an aha moment that makes you think differently about something.
Thank you. I'll tell you that. It's my aha moment was understanding the difference between wealth and riches.
Ah,
So what I came to is that riches are the things that money can buy, and we need riches. They're important to pay the rent and the mortgage and whatever. But if you have riches and lack wealth, and wealth is the ability to appreciate the things that money can never buy.
yeah.
So that at the worst of my life, there's the sunset, the sunrise, there is that moment of my daughter placing her hand
Mm,
on me or calling. She called up before to call with you to check in on me. And my son, and to have those moments. And if I had all the money in the world, those moments
yeah.
could not be more precious. So for me, I think about myself as trying to, as one said, be like water,
Yeah.
and to fill the as much of the glass with that understanding that I need both wealth and riches. And if I don't have one, if I have the other and I had a choice, at this point in my life, I'll choose the wealth.
Oh, so beautiful. I love that. As you're saying that, it reminded me, I went to this workshop years ago now, and they did this exercise about money. And what an eye opener it was for me about the baggage we carry about money. And it was just, you had to partner off and have people say really quickly, and they would be writing down your answers and just trigger you with questions about, what is money? What is rich? What is wealth? And different, and how our answers changed to those questions, and it brought up all of this baggage we had. So that was a beautiful insight. So where can our listeners find out more about you, Derek? Where would you want us to direct
Well,
them?
you can certainly go to my LinkedIn profile. Just look up my name. There's a lot of information there and links to our website and lots of things. There are a number of articles online that will reinforce, especially on the LinkedIn profile. So for some of the content that we talked about and the foundations for that, I really would appreciate if folks would look at that. Before we get off, a joy. I feel like I know you, and it's an absolute joy and privilege. And we're kind of peas in a pod in some way.
We
So
are.
I love it, with a different perspective is fantastic. So it's been joyful for me, really
Yeah.
joyful. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
and thank you. I've loved this conversation. And I'll admit, Derek, coming in, because I saw some of your stuff and it was like on site. And then I saw somewhere in a bio where it spoke to you talking about obliterating the other side. And I'm like, what? This seems so inconsistent. So this has been such a joy and treat and conversation. Definitely going to have you back. And for our listeners, we'll make sure to put all of Derek's info on the show notes as well. So I do encourage you to follow up, check out his books. We'll make sure to give those a plug on the show notes as well. All of life is a negotiation. So make sure you have as much perspective as possible to allow you to do it well. So again, thank you, Derek. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you. See you again.
You bet. And I have no doubt for our listeners out there is no way that you didn't get tons of value from this episode. So please give the gift of sharing. Share this episode with other people so that they can apply some of these principles in ways that maybe they haven't thought about to up-level their negotiation skills so that it can affect, better relationships with their kids, with their intimate partner, and their business deals across the board. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done that already. And before we sign off today, as always, if you're looking to some ways that we could work together and up-level your negotiation skills, I've got everything from group to online to mastermind one-on-one VIP experiences to help you leverage your power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. If that sounds interesting, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com. Make sure to grab my book of the same name if you haven't done that yet, Art of Feminine Negotiation. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.